Gather round, folks, and let me spin you a tale from the dusty plains of the old American frontier, a story of heartbreak redemption and a quiet man's unlikely heroism. Imagine a cruel husband so desperate for riches that he'd auction off his pregnant wife to the highest bidder. Picture a saloon teeming with rowdy onlookers, ready to barter a woman's future for a fistful of dollars. Then behold the stranger, a rancher with kind eyes who steps forward to save her, bidding not gold, but genuine compassion. Stay close now, because this is no ordinary yarn. This is a story you won't soon forget. It was 1882, and the scorching Arizona sun had turned the sky a pale, burnished white. The dusty town of Dry Gulch lay silent in the heat, the parched wind scraping the dirt streets like sandpaper across old bones. Tucked away at the edge of Main Street stood the Lonesome Gale Saloon, a place that knew its share of sorrow and sin. It was there that Andrew Carter, nursing a cheap whiskey hat, pulled low over his eyes, glared at anyone who dared to wander within 3 feet of his corner table. Andrew was a tall man, with the swagger of someone who believed the world owed him a living. He had a proud tilt to his chin, and a heart as dry and barren as the Arizona desert. His wife, Josephine Carter, was in her 5th month of pregnancy, her belly rounding beneath a faded calico dress. She hovered near the bar, eyes downcast, voice soft like a bird that had lost its song. Many rumored she had once been a sweet, laughing girl, the type whose laughter sounded like crystal bells. Now she wore bruises on her arms and sorrow in her gaze. Wyatt Earp himself had passed through Dry Gulch a few months before stopping for a meal on his way to Tombstone. Locals claimed he'd eyed Andrew Carter, hunched as always at the saloon, and spat in the dirt, muttering something about scoundrels that give the West a bad name. Josephine never forgot that day. In her mind, Wyatt Earp had recognized her husband for what he was, a gambler who had lost not just money, but his soul. Andrew spent his days and nights at the poker tables, cursing his luck under the flickering lamplight. That sweltering evening, he had a plan brewing in his whiskey-soaked mind, something as twisted as a rattlesnake. He had debts to settle and no prospects. The ranch he'd inherited from his father had burned down last year. Insurance dried up, leaving him with only worthless land and an appetite for the devil's own mischief. Josephine carrying his child was nothing more than a possession to him, collateral on legs her value, determined by how much money she could fetch. And that was where his vile idea sprouted a desperate gamble to pawn off his pregnant wife. The next afternoon, the rumor swirled like tumbleweed on a windy day. Old man Jed Thompson, who ran the town's only feed store, told Miss Eloise Baker at her boarding house. Miss Eloise whispered to the traveling preacher, Reverend Clark. By evening, the entire population of Dry Gulch, fewer than 200 souls, knew Andrew Carter aimed to auction off Josephine to pay his debts. Outrage flickered, but never roared. Andrew had a reputation for violence, and the townspeople were uncertain how to intervene. Women lowered their voices in hushed conversation, men shook their heads, and children peeked around corners wide-eyed at the prospect of something terrible about to unfold. Josephine wandered the dusty street in a daze, her slender arms cradling her pregnant belly. Some folks offered her small kindnesses, a piece of bread, a place to rest, but never dared to defy Andrew outright. Inside, Josephine felt a silent fury. She wasn't always so meek. Once she had a spine of steel. But heartbreak after heartbreak had chipped away at her. Now her main concern was for the tiny life inside her. She prayed for a miracle, or at least a spark of hope in all this darkness. That same day, a stranger rode into town. His name was Thomas McAllister, and he guided his horse, an old dappled mare named Sagebrush, into the livery stable with a gentle hand. Thomas was neither young nor old. He wore the dust of years on his boots, but carried a calm sense of purpose. A broad-brimmed hat shaded a strong, quiet face, and his body, lean with muscle, hinted at long hours of honest labor. He was a rancher by trade, hailing from the outskirts of Abilene before drifting west in search of new land. He took a room at Miss Eloise's boarding house, greeting her in a voice so soft she had to lean in to catch his name. Over supper, Thomas overheard talk of the coming auction. Disgust tightened his jaw, though he masked it behind carefully measured words. Miss Eloise noticed, though. She recognized in Thomas a kind-heartedness that could be easily mistaken for timidity. "We don't see that kind of evil in these parts too often," she said, shaking her head. "But Andrew Carter's a lost cause." Thomas listened. He learned that Josephine was pregnant and had nowhere to go. Later, he retreated to the stables to check on Sagebrush, lying awake on a bed of sweet hay, troubled by what he had heard. Somewhere across that dusty street, a woman with child was facing a fate no human should endure. Come twilight, the saloon glowed like a beacon of vice against the darkening sky. Andrew Carter slouched at the bar, his plan now public knowledge. Patrons gave him sidelong glances. Some whispered that he might not go through with it. Others told themselves they didn't want to get involved. Josephine sat on a wooden bench outside, gazing up at the stars. Memories of her childhood on a small farm outside Yuma came floating back. Her father, James Gray, had been a gentle soul who died too young. Her mother, Mary Gray, tried her best to raise Josephine right, teaching her the virtues of kindness and resilience. Josephine closed her eyes and tried to summon that resilience now. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling a faint flutter. Despite the terror, she clung to the promise of motherhood, an unbreakable bond that for the moment kept her breathing. Andrew emerged from the saloon, swaggering over to Josephine. His breath reeked of whiskey, and his eyes shone with greed. "Tomorrow," he announced, voice rasping, "we settle my debts. Best do yourself up nice. Might get a better price." With a sneer, he staggered off into the dark, leaving Josephine trembling on the bench. Peering around the corner, Thomas McAllister watched the scene unseen by either of them. His fists tightened at his sides. He had known cruelty before having lost his own sister to a vicious drunk who had left her battered and broken. Thomas had sworn never to allow such evil to fester if he could stop it. Now the promise from his past returned. But how could he intervene here without fueling more violence? The next morning, Dry Gulch wore a heavy stillness, as though the very air held its breath. Word had spread far ranchers from neighboring counties. Travelers and curious passers-by flocked to witness the unthinkable. A makeshift platform was set up outside the lonesome Gale Saloon, a rickety wooden stage that creaked ominously in the breeze. Andrew, sporting a freshly brushed jacket, stood at the edge of the platform with a crooked grin. He barked out insults and invitations in equal measure, urging anyone with money to step up. Like a vile circus ringleader, he reveled in the spectacle of it all. Josephine stood off to the side, arms wrapped around her abdomen, eyes scanning the crowd for a shred of compassion. Her cheeks burned in shame. She felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. She would not give Andrew the satisfaction. The entire fiasco was an assault on her dignity, a final betrayal she could scarcely believe was real. Among the onlookers, Thomas McAllister watched from under the brim of his hat. Disgust welled in his throat. Part of him screamed to challenge Andrew on the spot, but he feared a sudden confrontation might end in gunfire or put Josephine in greater danger. Andrew cleared his throat, a dramatic flourish. "Gentlemen," he called, "and ladies if any are so inclined, I present to you a rare opportunity. A strong, able and fertile wife with child for sale. Who'll start the bidding?" Gasps and mutters coursed through the crowd. A group of 4 men from out of town, each dirtier than the next, eyed Josephine with ugly leers. One of them snickered. "I'll offer $20. She's with child already, so half the work is done." Another cackled. "Make it 30. Josephine felt her heart pound, each bid a punch to her soul. She prayed for divine intervention. Thomas inhaled sharply. He looked down at the small leather pouch on his belt. It held just enough of his savings to buy a second horse and supplies crucial for the ranch he hoped to build. But what was a ranch compared to a human life? Andrew smirked, a savage glint in his eyes. "We have 30. Do I hear 35? Someone from the back piped up. 40. A hush fell. That was a decent sum in those days, especially for a drifter or a poor farmer. Andrew nodded eagerly, spitting onto the platform in anticipation. Silence. Then from the quiet side of the crowd, a calm voice. "I'll pay $100. Heads whipped around to see Thomas McAllister stepping forward. He lifted his hat, revealing steady, unyielding eyes. Andrew blinked. This was far more than he'd dreamed. Whispers rose in the throng. $100 was a small fortune in Dry Gulch. Josephine's breath caught. Who was this man? Going once, Andrew crowed, riding high on greed. Going twice! Hold it! A gruff voice barked. One of the 4 out-of-town men shoved his way forward. He was a burly, scar-faced fellow with the aura of a cutthroat. 120, he growled. Laughter rippled among his companions. Thomas's jaw clenched. He hesitated. The money in his pouch amounted to $110, no more. He'd saved every penny for years, but he was short $10 to beat the new offer. He glanced around, uncertain if anyone in the crowd would help. From the back, a woman's voice spoke up. I'll lend him the difference. It was Miss Eloise Baker, stepping out from behind a cluster of bystanders. She held up a small coin purse. It ain't right what's happening. My late husband, God rest his soul, would want me to do the honorable thing. Thomas nodded gratefully. 130, he said, raising the bid, his voice resolute. Scarface sneered. 140, he countered, pushing the price higher. Andrew's eyes danced with excitement, though he played it casual. He never expected such a windfall. Thomas swallowed. He glanced over at Miss Eloise, who bit her lip and shook her head. She didn't have more to spare. This was it. Josephine's heart sank, tears brimming. Scarface was the kind of man who might treat her worse than Andrew. She pleaded silently for a miracle. Thomas closed his eyes, the memory of his sister's suffering ghosting through his mind. He squared his shoulders. I don't have more in coin, he said, voice carrying. But I do have a horse in the stable Sagebrush, valued at about $30. She's old but dependable. I'll include her. That's 140 in coin and items plus the horse. Altogether, that's near 170. A wave of shock rolled through the crowd. Thomas was giving up his only means of riding his loyal mare, the sole companion he had on the open road. But it was enough to outbid Scarface, and then some. Andrew's face lit up. Sold to the quiet gentleman with the big heart and the bigger purse, he boomed sarcastically. Come on up and pay. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Thomas strode onto the platform, ignoring Andrew's leering grin, and set his pouch of money on a battered table. Miss Eloise slipped him the extra coins which he added to the pile. Then he took off his hat, set it on the table, and spoke loud enough for all to hear. The mare is in Jed Thompson's stable. She's yours to claim. Scarface stomped away, cursing under his breath, his cronies trailing behind. Andrew spun around, waving Josephine up onto the stage. Well, come on then, he barked. You're his now. In the hush, Josephine's gaze flicked to Thomas. She saw in his eyes none of the malice or lust she'd grown used to in Andrew's company. Instead, she saw something that stole her breath. Compassion. The tears she'd held back spilled over. Thomas reached for her hand. Miss Josephine, he said quietly, if it's all right, I'd like to take you somewhere safe. And if you'll have me, I'm prepared to do right by you and your child. He couldn't exactly claim it was love at first sight, not in the romantic sense, but there was a deep sense of conviction, a vow. Josephine, tears shining on her cheeks, nodded. She realized that this was the only chance she had. Andrew was already pocketing the money, not even bothering to watch them. Thomas took a deep breath. Reverend Clark, he called. The old preacher stepped forward from the crowd, surprise lighting his eyes. Thomas turned to Josephine. I figure if we're to do this properly, let's do it now. The hush deepened. Reverend Clark, though taken aback, stood between them, pulling out his well-worn Bible. He said a few solemn words, and Thomas and Josephine became husband and wife right there on the dusty platform, where she'd nearly been sold to the highest bidder. When the ceremony ended, a few scattered cheers and applause rose from the crowd. One by one, people drifted away, shaking their heads or congratulating the newlyweds. Josephine blinked through tears, half in a daze. Andrew was nowhere to be seen already, off spending his ill-gotten gains, presumably. Thomas gently guided Josephine off the stage, a protective arm around her trembling shoulders. Her new husband, a quiet rancher who in a moment of righteous indignation had rescued her from a life of misery. Thomas needed to retrieve a wagon if they were going to leave Dry Gulch with Josephine. Fortunately, Jed Thompson had an old buckboard for sale at a fair price. Now nearly broke, Thomas bartered the last items of value. He owned his father's old rifle and a pair of silver spurs to secure the wagon. Josephine watched him sacrifice possession after possession for her safety. Some locals offered well wishes and supplies, a bundle of blankets, a few jugs of water, some salted meat, and even a small basket of apples from Miss Eloise. Josephine thanked them all, her voice trembling with gratitude. For the first time in months, she felt hope blossoming in her chest. Before leaving, Thomas took her to the boarding house so she could rest. That night, Josephine confided in him how Andrew had courted her with false charm, how she believed he'd change after the wedding, and how each passing month had eroded her faith. Thomas listened intently, his heart heavy for all she had endured. He shared a little of his own story. He had once been part of a ranching family in Abilene, but tragedy and heartbreak had scattered them, leaving him alone. Now he hoped to start anew, on a parcel of land near the Rio Salado, which he'd purchased with the last of his inheritance. In the early dawn, they set off the wagon, rattling under the soft pink horizon. Josephine sat beside Thomas, still shell-shocked but comforted by his presence. She rested a protective hand on her belly, grateful for every passing mile that distanced her from Andrew's cruelty. Days of travel under the harsh desert sun took a toll, especially on Josephine. But Thomas was patient. He insisted they stop frequently so she could rest in the shade and drink water. As they meandered along dusty trails, they passed through small outposts and homesteads. Sometimes they glimpsed strangers whose wide-eyed stares hinted they had heard rumors of the woman auctioned in Dry Gulch. Eventually they arrived at a modest homestead, a single-room cabin perched on a gentle slope overlooking a winding creek. A couple of scraggly cottonwood trees provided a dapple of shade. The cabin was plain a single window and a sturdy door. To Josephine, it was more glorious than any mansion, because here she felt safe. Thomas had already started clearing a small plot for a garden, though weeds had reclaimed it during his absence. Nearby stood a half-built barn, waiting for a roof. It was hardly perfect, but to them it was the promise of a future. That first night, after a simple meal of beans and bread, Josephine stepped outside to take in the vast, starry sky. Thomas joined her. She exhaled a shaky breath. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. Thomas shook his head, setting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what's right. But I won't lie. It's going to be tough. I don't have much, and we'll have to work hard to make this place livable." Josephine's eyes glowed with determination. "That's all right. I've worked hard all my life. I'm not afraid." She hesitated, glancing at her belly. "I only worry about bringing a child into the world under these circumstances." Thomas's gaze flickered with warmth. "We'll do our best to make sure this child has a better life than what you've had to endure." In the hush of the desert night, they forged a fragile peace, hopeful for tomorrow. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm. Every dawn, Thomas rose to tend to chores, hauling water, mending fences, building the barn. Josephine, despite her growing belly, worked by his side when she could, planting seeds, cooking simple meals, sweeping out the cabin. But Andrew Carter's shadow loomed. Josephine would often startle at the slightest noise, heart pounding with the fear that Andrew might appear on the horizon demanding more. She confided in Thomas, and he assured her, "If he comes, he'll have to go through me first." Once or twice a traveling merchant arrived, bringing gossip from Dry Gulch. They reported that Andrew had squandered most of his new fortune in a matter of weeks, gambling in Tombstone and losing big to a man named Doc Holliday. The merchant said Andrew had been thrown out of the saloon after starting a fight. He left penniless and furious. Hearing this, Josephine's heart seized. She knew Andrew's viciousness, and she worried where he might wander next. Thomas took precautions. He started sleeping with a loaded shotgun by the cabin door. He taught Josephine how to aim a small revolver. Just in case he told her, though, neither of them hoped it would come to that. One late afternoon, they heard the clip-clop of hooves and the rumble of wagon wheels. Thomas stepped onto the porch hand, hovering near his holstered revolver, nerves taut. A covered wagon emerged in the distance, driven by a middle-aged couple. As they drew closer, Thomas recognized them. Henry and Martha Burton ranchers from a few valleys over. He'd met them briefly during his travels, and they had spoken kindly of Josephine and Thomas's marriage. Henry tugged the reins, halting the wagon. "Thomas McAllister," Heard you were settling in. We brought some supplies. Grain beans, a little flour, and sugar, too. Figured you could use them. Thomas offered them a broad smile, relief coursing through him. That's mighty kind of you. They spent the evening in warm conversation around a small fire. Martha noticed Josephine's pregnancy, fussing over her kindly. We have a midwife in our settlement. Name's Clara Hudson. Skilled as they come. When the time's near, we'll send word for her. Josephine felt a tear slip down her cheek as gratitude overwhelmed her. For so long she had only known cruelty and indifference. Now here were neighbors willing to help in ways that truly mattered. Before departing the next morning, Henry pulled Thomas aside and said quietly, "Keep your guard up. I've heard talk that Andrew Carter might be heading this way, looking for revenge. Man like that doesn't give up easy." Thomas nodded, jaw tight. He had half expected this. After seeing the Burtons off, he turned to Josephine, determination shining in his eyes. "We stand together. I won't let him near you." Josephine's hand found his, her fingers curling around his calloused palm. "We stand together," she echoed. Despite the constant worry, Josephine found moments of joy. As her belly rounded further, she felt the baby kicking, giving her renewed strength. She discovered Thomas had a wry sense of humor beneath his quiet demeanor. He'd tell her little stories about the silly misadventures of ranch life he'd experienced or heard of in Abilene. Sometimes they'd laugh until tears rolled down their cheeks momentarily, forgetting the cruelty of the past. They began decorating the little cabin. Josephine sewed curtains from spare cloth, and Thomas fashioned a proper bed frame out of pine logs. They even pressed flowers to hang on the walls. Slowly, it was becoming a home. Thomas found a wild mustang grazing along the creek one morning and managed to corral it with surprising skill. Josephine marveled at the gentleness in his approach, the same kindness he'd shown her. Over weeks he tamed the horse, naming him Valor. With Sagebrush gone as part of the auction deal, Valor became the ranch's new workhorse. Life was hard, but it was honest. They fell into a companionship that bordered on affection. There were awkward moments. They were, after all, strangers who married under dire circumstances. But mutual respect and shared labor drew them closer, forging a bond tempered by adversity. Summer storms rolled in dark clouds looming over the mountains. Lightning cracked across the sky, thunder echoing in the distance. Josephine stood on the porch, uneasy. She sensed something else in the wind, something beyond the weather. That evening, as rain battered the roof, they heard footsteps sloshing in the mud outside. Thomas grabbed the shotgun, opening the door a crack. A lone figure staggered into the faint lantern light, sopping wet and half-collapsed. Thomas lowered his weapon upon recognizing him. It was Jed Thompson from Dry Gulch. Jed's face was pale, lips trembling. They dragged him inside and helped him to a chair near the fire. Josephine offered him a blanket, fear thrumming in her veins. Jed panted, clutching a piece of torn paper. "I came to warn you. Andrew Carter's on his way. He's got men with him, says you cheated him. He claims Josephine is still his property, that you forced the sale." He coughed, water dripping from his hat. Thomas's face went stony. He set the shotgun aside, but kept it within arm's reach. How many men Jed swallowed? At least 4. Might be more. All of them drifters looking for trouble. Andrew's been bragging he'll get Josephine back or make you pay in blood. Josephine leaned against the wall, dizziness washing over her. The baby rolled inside her, as if sensing her distress. Jed continued. They left Dry Gulch 2 days ago, headed in this direction. I borrowed a horse and rode hard to warn you. Figured you might need a head start if you wanted to run. Thomas glanced at Josephine, whose eyes were wide with terror. He thought of the half-built barn, the newly planted garden. Running meant leaving everything behind, starting over once again. But staying meant facing Andrew's wrath. Still, he wasn't a man to flee easily. Thank you, Jed. Thomas murmured, patting the man's shoulder. Stay the night. In the morning we'll figure out what to do. The storm raged on outside. Josephine tried to sleep, but found her mind racing. She imagined Andrew's sneering face, remembered the bruises, the humiliations. Next to her, Thomas lay awake, his arm draped protectively across her. She took comfort in his warmth and resolved not to let fear dictate her life. Sunrise revealed muddy fields and a drenched yard, but the storm had passed. Jed prepared to head back to Dry Gulch, though Thomas insisted he stay for breakfast. They discussed the odds. Andrew and his hired guns could arrive any time within the next day or two. Thomas had but a single shotgun, a revolver, and a handful of ammunition. Josephine was no stranger to firearms now, but in her condition, fighting off a gang seemed impossible. They decided to fortify the cabin. Thomas stacked crates and furniture along the inside walls to provide cover. He checked the doors and windows, nailing extra planks where needed. Josephine packed essentials into a satchel in case they had to flee at a moment's notice. Jed, apologetic, said he had to return to look after his store. I wish I could stay, but my business is all I got. If I don't tend it, I'll be ruined. They understood. Gratitude filled Josephine's eyes. Thank you for warning us, Mr. Thompson. You might have saved our lives. Jed tipped his hat. Just doing what's right. With that, he rode off, leaving them alone once more. Thomas and Josephine spent the day in tense anticipation. He showed her how to reload the revolver, guiding her trembling fingers over the cartridges. She prayed fervently that they wouldn't need to use it. They came at twilight. Josephine was on the porch, scanning the horizon when she saw a dust cloud rising. She dashed inside, whispering, "They're here." Thomas handed her the revolver and readied the shotgun heart, pounding like a hammer. Andrew Carter appeared first, riding a dark stallion. He reined in just beyond shotgun range, flanked by 6 men on horseback. Each man had the look of a hired thug, guns hanging loosely at their hips. Andrew spotted Josephine peeking from the window. He spat into the dirt, a cruel grin twisting his face. "Josephine," he bellowed, "you belong to me. Always have, always will." "Get out here." Thomas stepped onto the porch, the shotgun cradled in his arms. "She's my wife now, Andrew. We have the papers signed by the preacher in Dry Gulch. You took the money. This is over." Andrew let out a bitter laugh. "Not hardly, rancher. You cheated me. She's carrying my child, and that means the sale was invalid. I want her back, and the money you stole from me." One of the hired guns spat. "You can hand her over or we'll take her." Another added, "Don't matter to us. We're getting paid either way." Thomas's face hardened. "You'll have to kill me first." He raised the shotgun hammer, cocked. Josephine, trembling, was hidden behind the door with the revolver. Andrew sneered. "That can be arranged." Boys. Gunfire erupted. Bullets whizzed past, splintering the porch railing. Thomas fired back, scattering Andrew's men, but they circled the cabin, forcing him to retreat inside. Josephine crouched by the window, returning fire with shaky resolve, protecting the unborn child she carried. The outlaws spread out, taking cover behind rocks and the half-built barn. Thomas managed to wound one man in the leg, who yowled and scrambled for safety. Another shot grazed Thomas's arm, drawing blood. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain. Inside the cabin, Josephine's breath came in ragged gasps. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils. She remembered the revolver lessons, gripping the gun with both hands to steady her aim. Every shot she fired reminded her of the life inside her. She was protecting her baby at all costs. Andrew's voice cut through the chaos. "You can't hold out forever. Let Josephine come to me, and I'll spare your worthless hide." Thomas's reply was to rack another shell into the shotgun. The moment Andrew poked his head out, Thomas fired the shot, peppering the ground near Andrew's horse. The animal reared, nearly throwing Andrew off. One of the thugs lit a bundle of rags, flinging it onto the roof. Flames licked at the cabin's shingles. Josephine coughed as smoke seeped in. "Thomas, the fire." "I'll handle it," Thomas growled. He grabbed a bucket of water they'd prepared and climbed onto a chair to reach the flames through the window. Bullets pelted the wall around him. Josephine returned fire in frantic bursts, forcing the outlaws to duck. With a heroic effort, Thomas managed to drench the flames, though smoke still curled ominously in the rafters. Andrew's men pressed closer, a barrage of shots peppering the front of the cabin. The old door buckled, but held. Thomas and Josephine were running low on ammunition. Their position was dire, pinned down with no way out. Josephine felt panic welling up. What if Andrew took her and the baby? Fear turned to steely resolve. She would not let them steal her life again. In the midst of the gunfire, a new sound reached their ears. Thunderous hoofbeats from beyond the ridge. For a heart-stopping moment, Josephine and Thomas feared reinforcements for Andrew. But then a voice boomed, "Drop your weapons or you'll answer to me." It was Henry Burton, leading a posse of neighboring ranchers, about 10 strong, all armed and determined. Word had gotten around that Andrew Carter was causing trouble. The Burtons had rallied their neighbors to intervene. Andrew and his men turned stunned by the sudden arrival of a group that outnumbered them. Henry Burton leveled his rifle. "Andrew Carter, we've heard about your crimes. Lay down your arms or we'll do it for you." Chaos erupted. Some of Andrew's men tried to mount a last stand, but the ranchers firing from higher ground forced them to surrender. Andrew, furious, wheeled his horse, aiming to escape. Thomas burst through the smoldering cabin doorway, shotgun raised. Their eyes locked. Andrew snarled and drew his pistol. A single shot rang out. Andrew dropped the gun, howling as he clutched his shoulder. Thomas lowered his smoking shotgun. He had aimed to wound, not to kill. Andrew tumbled from his horse, rolling in the dirt, blood staining his shirt. Henry Burton and 2 ranchers rushed forward, disarming Andrew and the remaining outlaws. The last echo of gunfire drifted away on the breeze, leaving only the heavy breathing of men and the crackling of dying flames on the cabin's roof. Josephine, shaking and coughing, emerged from the doorway. She clung to Thomas, relief crashing over her like a tidal wave. The baby stirred inside her, a reminder that life beat on. Henry Burton's posse took Andrew Carter and his wounded men into custody. They tied them to their horses, preparing to escort them back to Dry Gulch, where they would stand trial for attempted murder, kidnapping, and a slew of other charges. Andrew spat and cursed, his eyes full of hatred. When he glanced at Josephine, she felt a shiver of fear, but Thomas's arm around her gave her courage. Before leaving, Henry clasped Thomas's shoulder. "I'm sorry we didn't come sooner. We rode as fast as we could once we heard. Thomas nodded. You saved our lives, Josephine added, voice trembling. Thank you. Thank you all. Andrew shot in the shoulder and bleeding hissed at Josephine. You're making a mistake. That rancher can't provide for you. You'll end up begging in the street. She lifted her chin, eyes brimming with fierce pride she'd almost forgotten she possessed. I'd rather beg in the street than spend another day as your wife. Her hand found Thomas's, her wedding ring glinting in the fading sunlight. But I won't be begging. We'll be just fine. The posse set off, Andrew and his men in tow, followed by a swirl of dust. Josephine let out a shaky breath, leaning into Thomas's chest. Finally, the immediate danger had passed. In the weeks that followed, the cabin bore scars of the gunfight, bullet holes, pockmarked the walls, and a section of the roof needed rebuilding. Josephine and Thomas worked tirelessly with help from neighbors who came to patch the roof and fix the damage. They offered more than nails and boards. They brought fellowship and a growing sense of community. A traveling judge eventually arrived in Dry Gulch. Andrew Carter was found guilty of multiple crimes and sentenced to a long spell in Yuma Territorial Prison. Josephine felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Though Andrew had caused her immeasurable pain, he was still the father of her child. Yet she knew he was a dangerous man who needed to be kept away. As the seasons shifted, the ranch blossomed. Vegetables sprouted in the garden. The half-built barn was finally completed, and Thomas managed to barter for another horse. Josephine's belly grew until it seemed she might burst at any moment. With every new morning, the ranch felt more like a sanctuary, a testament to their resilience. Late one night, Josephine woke Thomas with a sharp gasp. Pain knifed through her abdomen. She recognized the onset of labor. Fear and excitement warred in her expression as she clutched Thomas's hand. Sweat beading on her brow, Thomas saddled Valor and rode hard to fetch Clara Hudson, the midwife Henry Burton had spoken of. Clara arrived just in time, her experienced hands guiding Josephine through wave after wave of excruciating contractions. Thomas paced outside the cabin, anxiety gnawing at him. Through the wooden walls he heard Josephine's cries. Each one tore at his heart. At dawn the screams subsided, replaced by the startled wail of a newborn. Clara stepped onto the porch, a tired smile on her face. "It's a boy," she announced. "You have a healthy son." Relief and joy crashed over Thomas in equal measure. He rushed inside, finding Josephine pale but radiant, holding a tiny bundle to her chest. She gazed up at him with tears in her eyes. Thomas, meet James McAllister. She had named him after her late father. Thomas bent down, kissing Josephine's forehead, and then the baby's downy head. He felt an overwhelming protectiveness surge in his chest, a vow to keep them safe always. The weeks after James's birth were a whirlwind of exhaustion, tenderness, and a kind of quiet joy neither Thomas nor Josephine had ever known. The nights were long and sleepless. James had lungs like a stagecoach horn and a stubbornness that rivaled his mother's. But the sound of his cries was like a promise fulfilled, a declaration that life had gone on, and something beautiful had taken root where pain once reigned. Josephine cradled her son in the early hours, her body aching, and her thoughts often drifting back through the shadows of her past. She remembered the auction block, the humiliation, the bruises, and then she'd look into her son's bright eyes, so full of newness, and feel the weight of it lift if only for a moment. Thomas was tireless. He rose early to tend the animals, then helped Josephine with the baby, never once complaining. He learned to soothe James with a humming lullaby he barely remembered from his own childhood, and when Josephine needed sleep. He held the child for hours, whispering stories of what their ranch would one day become. It wasn't just fatherhood that transformed Thomas. It was love, finally allowed to bloom after years of solitude. Neighbors from across the valley began to stop by more frequently. Henry and Martha Burton visited with fresh eggs' milk and hearty loaves of bread. Miss Eloise, who made the journey all the way from Dry Gulch, brought a handmade quilt for James and insisted on staying a few days to help Josephine recover. "I never had children of my own," she said gently, tucking the quilt around the baby. "But if I did, I'd want a daughter as brave as you." Josephine smiled through tears. The affection of these people, many of whom had once been strangers, felt like salve over old wounds. Still, there were dark moments. Sometimes in the dead of night, Josephine would wake from dreams drenched in fear. In them, Andrew stood at the cabin door, face twisted with rage, demanding she return. Once she startled awake, screaming, clutching James so tightly that the infant cried out in protest. Thomas held her afterward, his arms encircling both mother and child. "You're safe," he whispered again and again. "He can't hurt you. Not now. Not ever again." And it was true. Word had come from Dry Gulch. Andrew Carter had been sentenced to a long stretch in Yuma Territorial Prison, found guilty not only of attempted kidnapping and assault, but also of fraudulent transactions tied to the auction. Witnesses came forward. Even some of his own hired guns testified against him, trading testimony for lighter punishments. Justice at last had spoken. One quiet afternoon, Josephine sat on the porch, rocking James, watching Thomas repair the barn roof. She traced her fingers over the baby's cheeks and thought, "This is peace." Not the fragile kind, built on silence and fear, but the real kind, built on love and truth. Thomas came down the ladder, his face flushed and damp with sweat. He walked over, brushing a hand against James's tiny back before kissing Josephine's forehead. "You two are my whole world," he said softly. "And you're ours," she whispered back. For the first time in a long while, Josephine wasn't surviving. She was living, and the future, once a thing to dread, now glowed with promise. In time, Thomas and Josephine realized their marriage, born out of desperation, had slowly matured into something neither of them had dared hope, for genuine affection, rooted in shared hardship, quiet admiration, and a sense of home they built together. One fence post, one sunrise at a time. Their days were still hard, filled with work from dawn till dusk, but now laughter often replaced the silence. In the evenings when the sky painted itself in hues of violet and gold, they'd sit on the porch with James nestled in Josephine's lap, and Thomas beside them, his calloused fingers gently tracing the baby's tiny toes. One such evening, after the boy had fallen asleep in his cradle, Josephine stood by the window, staring out at the moonlight blanketing the hills. The past felt like another life, one where bruises colored her skin, and silence was her only shield. Now there was stillness, yes, but it was the peaceful kind, not the suffocating kind, that comes from fear. She turned to see Thomas by the fireplace, cleaning his tools with methodical care. The warm glow of the fire reflected off his strong features, highlighting the crease in his brow and the glint of silver near his temple, a sign of the hardships he'd endured. She approached slowly, her heart racing, not out of fear, but because of what she was about to say. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up immediately, setting down the oilcloth and giving her his full attention. "Something wrong?" She sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "No, nothing's wrong. I've been thinking." He waited patiently, not pressing her just like he always did, giving her room to find her voice. "You saved my life," she said, eyes locked onto the flames. "But it wasn't just that day at the auction or the night Andrew came back. It's every day since then. You've given me something I thought I'd never have again, dignity, and choices, and kindness." Thomas's expression softened. He reached for her hand, but didn't speak just yet. Josephine continued, her voice thick with emotion. "At first I thought I was just surviving again, doing what I had to do. But over these months, I've come to care for you, deeply, and not just for what you've done, for who you are. I love the man who wakes before dawn, to tend the animals, who builds a bed frame by hand, who makes our boy laugh with nonsense stories. I love you, Thomas McAllister." The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and raw. Thomas let out a shaky breath and took both her hands in his. "I never expected to feel this way again," he said, voice low and thick. "But I do. I love you, Josephine. You and James are my whole world. I want to grow old with you, build this land into something that lasts, and watch our son become a man we can both be proud of." A tear slid down her cheek, and she leaned into him. Their lips met in a kiss that wasn't fiery or rushed. It was quiet and sure, built on everything they'd endured and everything they now hoped for. That night, the stars above the ranch seemed to shimmer a little brighter, and inside the cabin, once a place of temporary shelter, love had fully taken root. Word of what happened out at the McAllister ranch didn't stay local for long. It spread like wildfire, carried by travelers, ranch hands, merchants, and the occasional drifter who'd stopped for a drink in Dry Gulch or passed by the quiet homestead nestled near the Rio Salado. Around poker tables in Tombstone, over whiskey in Prescott, and beneath the lanterns of distant mining camps, the tale took on a life of its own. They called him the Quiet Rancher, a man who'd walked into a saloon full of sinners and bought a woman's dignity back with the last of his savings, and then gave up his horse to seal the deal. Some said he stared down a devil of a man with nothing but a calm voice and steady hands. Others swore he fought off an entire gang to protect the woman and child who had no one else. Even Doc Holliday was rumored to have remarked over a game of cards in Bisbee that McAllister fellow did more for justice with one shotgun and a vow than most sheriffs I've met in the territory. Wyatt Earp, upon hearing the story, while passing through Tucson, reportedly tipped his hat and muttered, "That's the kind of man we need more of." But none of that fame reached the ears of Thomas or Josephine directly. Not that they wanted it to. They stayed tucked away on their land, far from the saloons and headlines, raising their son in peace. Their cabin, once riddled with bullet holes, was repaired and fortified. A new roof kept out the desert rain, and wildflowers began blooming around the porch steps. The garden grew hearty squash and beans, and the barn, once only a frame, now stood tall and solid, home to chickens, goats, and 2 new horses Thomas had bartered for with labor and a few bushels of corn. Little James McAllister grew quickly under the Arizona sun, strong, curious, and already full of questions about the world. At night, Josephine would rock him by the fire, humming the lullabies her mother once sang on a farm outside Yuma. Thomas would sit nearby, carving wooden animals or mending gear, stealing glances at the boy and his mother with quiet pride. They didn't talk about Andrew Carter much anymore. Josephine had made her peace, not with what he'd done, but with the fact that his shadow no longer dictated her future. She wore her wedding ring proudly now, not just as a symbol of escape, but of choosing a life that honored her strength. In the nearby towns, the story continued to evolve into legend. Children played games pretending to be Josephine the Brave or Thomas the Quiet Sheriff, facing off against imaginary outlaws in dusty streets. A traveling minstrel even composed a song, the Ballad of Dry Gulch Bride, and performed it at rodeos and fairs from Tucson to Santa Fe. It was said that when the final verse hit, even the rowdiest cowboys quieted down. But for Thomas and Josephine, the true story wasn't one of fame or folk songs. It was the small daily victories, planting together in the spring, teaching James how to ride, watching the sunset over their land, while holding hands with the one person who had truly seen them and stayed. Thus ends the tale of how a cruel man tried to auction off his pregnant wife for money, and how a quiet rancher stepped forward not with violence or vanity, but with integrity, compassion, and a heart big enough to build a new life. A story of justice, redemption, and the kind of love the Wild West rarely knew, but desperately needed. And somewhere out there on a hill by a creek beneath an Arizona sky, Josephine and Thomas McAllister continued writing their own legend, one honest day at a time. Sometimes life's greatest trials turn strangers into family-forging bonds in the fires of hardship. Josephine and Thomas began as two lonely souls crossing paths in the most desperate of circumstances. Yet from danger and betrayal grew a refuge of love, hope, and resilience. Their story reminds us that even in the harshest frontier, kindness can prevail, and that a single act of courage can forever change a destiny. Thank you for joining me on this thrilling journey through the Old West. If this tale of grit and heart spoke to you, I invite you to be part of our storytelling community. Like this video to show your support, share it with friends who appreciate a dramatic yarn, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that bring the past to life. Together we'll keep these legends of perseverance and heroism alive for generations to come.